necessarily members of the party, but people, people working for the Morning Star, or people within that kind of cultural milieu that you looked up to.
Well, Bob Leeson, who's the book's editor, I learned a lot from him. And Jack, by being introduced to him through Bob, because Jack reviewed a lot. If you ever go through the cuttings, you'll find a lot of Jack Lindsay in the Daily Worker, Morning Star, both reviews and articles about anything from anthropology through to whatever. Yeah. He wrote about almost anything. So I continued to use him as a reviewer, which he was happy to do, both because he wrote very quickly, but also he knew a lot, and I thought he was a good guy. He would say, he'd say the things I wanted him to say. The stance he'd take towards something would be one that I would find, I'd be sympathetic to. So I tried to avoid people that I knew were going to, like with the Katyn book, you wouldn't give it to certain people who'd say this was terrible anti-Soviet propaganda.
Were they paid reviews?
No.
No. Okay.
And I got Raymond Williams to review.
Yeah.
I mean, I got all sorts of people did it. It's amazing. I always am. Perhaps I'm not amazed, but people like that who. I mean, I met Raymond Williams at Cambridge and asked him if he'd supervise me.
Yeah.
And he said, I have so many people. I'm supervising. And he just said, look, because I went to him because I said, I really don't know what to do because I find this place horrific. It's oppressive. I can't bear it. But I want to, I feel as somebody on the left, I ought to be, stepping up to the plate. Well, we didn't say that in those days.
There's actually a lot about your trajectory, which is, well, to put it bluntly, quite astonishing or baffling as well. Like, you seem to have been senior lecturer at Kingston whilst you were doing your PhD.
Well, just so you can get the cry. While I was at the Star, I was books editor, but I also then became theatre critic. Because Jack Sutherland, who'd done it before, who was also a good bloke, but found he didn't like a lot of the modern stuff anyway. Jack, because I talked to Jack a lot, knew that I was interested in theatre, so he let me do some reviews, liked what I did. He gave up and gave it over to me. So I became a theatre critic. I joined the Critics Circle and I did all that stuff, and became active in that. And there's a thing called the International Association of Theatre Critics, which is a part of all that UN stuff. And I was in that and went to conferences abroad as a theatre critic and journal. And through that, I started to read plays for the Royal Shakespeare Company, because by chance I met. I was in the pub next to the old Half Moon Theatre in the East End of London, and I by that time got to know a critic called Michael Coveney. So I was just sort of saying hello, and next to him was a guy who turned out to be the literary manager of the Royal Shakespeare Company. So Michael said, Colin, meet Walter. Walter said, would you be interested in, So I said, I'll read some play scripts for you, some money. Because I got a Morning Star wage, was just nothing. So it was like poverty wages. So
you were reading these plays to say, basically
whether they should be done or not.
Yeah.
So you get a play and you write a critique, you give it back to the literary manager and he reads it, and he then writes back to the writer saying, no thanks, we don't like it, whatever. Through Walter I got to know a director called Howard Davis, who's just died, and Howard was about to open the Warehouse, which is the small theatre that the RSC had for new plays, which is now called the Donmar, then it just called the Warehouse. And I got involved in that. I wrote stuff. They put out their own sort of writers' not newsletter, but a sort of self-public, little sort of, what do you call it really? Things about playwrights and stuff that went with the show. So if you had a new play, like Willie Russell educating Rita, I wrote a little thing about Willie Russell educating Rita. So I was getting into that world.
Yeah.
And then Walter wanted to be a director, so Trevor Nunn ran the theatre company. He said, you better come and work with me on a play, on a production, so I can see if you're any good at it. So when Walter was away doing that, Howard and he asked me to do Walter's job, which was coinciding with the demise of the Morning Star. I did that for 6 months, and then they wanted me to do it for another 6 months because Trevor Nunn had told Walter he wasn't going to be a director, so Walter left in a huff. So there's a gap, so I do that. Do you remember Time Out? Does that?
Yeah.
City Limits.
Sure, yeah.
City Limits was on strike.
Yeah.
City Limits was about to come back on the street. So Time Out wanted to. Time Out had gone because City Limits came out of the strike.
Yeah.
Time Out was on strike, and City Limits was coming out of the strike. Time Out wanted to come back on the street, so they asked me if I'd be the theatre editor of Time Out. I didn't really want to do that because all my friends were in City Limits, but on the other hand, it was a job and I'm going to be paid rather well. So I went to Trevor Nunn and said, I've been offered this job, I'd rather stay with the Royal Shakespeare Company, but not on this, I can't do 6 months. If you want to make me the literary manager of the company, then I won't do the City Limits, the Time Out job. So next day, Trevor said, okay, you're going to be literary manager of Royal Shakespeare. But the theatre and so my writing has always combined an interest, or those the cultural and the political, if that makes. So I don't, it's although it might not always be that obvious, but the book on unity is I suppose an obvious one because it's a left-wing theatre. I did a book about Buzz Goodbody and the Royal Shakespeare Company. She was a director at the RSC who was in the Communist Party, and I knew Buzz very well, and she killed herself. And so I did a book about her before, the whole thing about women directors and all that. So that was important for me. I did a book about the RSC because I thought, as a cultural institution, that's a politically important thing to analyse. Book about playwrights, most of whom it was a book coming at it from a political perspective, if you like. And I've done other stuff, but the one on Isadora Duncan, Charlie Chaplin, Paul Robeson, pretty obviously, politics is at the centre of that, and cultural commitment, and then the book on Black and Asian theatre, which again is a political project for me, because those are buried histories.
What is the relationship between Pan-Africanism and communism?
Tricky.
Big question.
Well, it comes out, first, if you go slightly back, because London, or Britain, let's say, because it was the centre of empire, you've also got it being the centre of the anti-slavery movement, because it was pretty hard in America. I mean, people were, but they tended to want to come over to Britain, and a lot of escaped slaves did, and the real force came from Britain, and Britain passed the axe before anybody else, abolishing slavery. And so you've already got a cultural swell around anti-slavery that then moves into the anti-colonial struggle. And again, because it's the centre of empire, and as after mid part of the 19th century, even more so, because at that point Victoria actually becomes Empress of India and all that stuff. So you get this extraordinary concentration of people in Britain, particularly in London, and the sort of the Pan-African movement, which interestingly was not just Black African, but it involved, it linked up with, although fractured off from, or they fractured off from later, the fight for Indian self-rule. But they were, certainly at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, doing a lot of things together. And they had, and culture, was an important part of their struggle. Cultural activity, and if you look at the Pan-African congresses that were held in London at the early 1900s, they always have a cultural element, and it's partly the sort of, if you like, the Shylock, do I not believe, I'm a human being like you are, and that's the sort of, if you like, a lot of it's within European notions of culture, but they're saying we can do that. You know, we are as valid as you are. But then it changed. The relation to communism changed through the 20th century because of the Soviet Union. So before you had any country that had a communist party in power, it was a more sort of, if like, an ideological thing. And you still find within the both within the fight for Indian independence as well as more specifically African independence, communists playing quite a leading role in those movements. But you then get the sort of the fractures that you get in the international communist movement, and certainly with the first major one with Trotsky, and when you get, for example, the invasion of Abyssinia by the Italians and the response to that, a lot of the Pan-Africanists thought the Soviet Union didn't support their struggle, and that pushed them more towards a Trotskyist position, and that sort of, and then the Spanish Civil War, a lot of people found they didn't like the role that Stalin played in that, and with the Soviet Nazi pact. So it sort of fractures out, but it's quite complicated because there's certainly up until the Second World War, there's you can't really look at one without the other.
That's fascinating. I'd been puzzling for a few years because I've read about how C.L.R. James was a Trotsky idealist.
Mainly around Abyssinia. He set up the main defence group over Abyssinia, and he and Robeson happened to be, they were in London at the same period, and were both being radicalised in England at the same time, and then they went different ways after Abyssinia, but you've got George Padmore there as well. I mean, Kenyatta, Nehru, extraordinary concentration of people. Robeson sticks with the Soviet Union, even though privately he knows what's going on. But he takes the view that you need a socialist state, and we must make it better and all that stuff, but don't attack it. And there are some people who believe his mental deterioration in the 50s is to do with him not being able to reconcile that contradiction, because he had Jewish friends and he was a great supporter of Jewish culture, and he knew Jews who were persecuted by and killed by Stalin, under Stalin's orders, not by Stalin, and so he knew what was happening, but he always stuck publicly with the Soviet, whereas C.L.R. James was a self-proclaimed Trotskyist. Sort of underlying, I suppose, in all my work is the idea that you can be politically engaged and creative, and they're not. And it's not that you then, as it were, somehow follow some puppet-like, that your creativity is only is sort of somehow being directed, but you can. But political and cultural engagement are not mutually considered or detrimental. And that's really why I wrote the book Here We Stand, which is the one on Robeson, Isidore Ong and Charlie Chaplin, to say you can be culturally active and politically active, and it's not necessarily, you can't just dismiss it all as propaganda if you're being political. And I suppose that was what I was trying to explore, which I haven't done properly, in a specific sense. I haven't actually written that book.
But I haven't written it yet. But this is the project that you are with John Berger and.
This was back in the 1970s.
Okay.
Because I was working with John on migration was the big, we thought, sort of a defining feature of capitalism.
Yeah.
which of course is subsequently, because of globalisation and now, you know, Brexit and Trump is absolutely proved to be the case. And I was at the Star and working with people in the hotel industry in London on articles about migrant workers and the workforce. And then also it was the time of the April Revolution in 1974 in Portugal. And one of the people I knew was Portuguese, and I stayed with her family and went out and covered the Portuguese Revolution for the Star. And so we were doing it, and John was working on a book which became, I think it's called A Seventh Man. A Seventh Man. I knew him through Ways of Seeing, so it was after Ways of Seeing, but not through much at that point. He was not the figure he became, and he hadn't written G and all those other, and now he's a venerable, 90 years old. And we knew, you know, I did a play that he and Niela Bielski wrote when I was at the RSC, so I kept in touch over the years. But I was asking really John's advice, because I wanted to do this book about lots of case studies on people who espouse communist ideas or left-wing ideas that could broadly be put under the communist umbrella. They didn't have to be party members. And they were all culturally significant. And I wanted to use the case studies to try and explore this, what to me, when I was that age, was this myth that you know, if you were a communist, you shot poets and you put them in prison. I was saying, you know, obviously Stalin did do that, but that's not what communism was about. And so I was starting to work out a series of people, and Jack Lindsay was going to be one of the people that I was going to use, but I didn't ever get beyond, because work, you know, and then I ended up doing the Unity book rather than that book, and the book about Buzz Goodbody, which was sort of the same thing. Buzz, as a Communist Party member, was a great theatre director, so that was sort of making my point, if you like. But I then got away from the original idea of the book.
You mentioned earlier that at school you studied Russian,
yes,
and that you were actually taken by your teacher to Russia.
Yeah.
There's obviously this old tradition of communists in, well, actually maybe not necessarily communists, but people, broadly speaking, left-wing people, going to the Soviet Union and kind of being shown the Soviet experiment. So, and I wonder whether you sort of see that experience of if that had any impact on.
It certainly opened me up to wanting to know more about it.
Yeah.
Because it moved beyond just being interested in the writing, because I was reading Gogol short stories, Solzhenitsyn. I mean, the teacher gave me Solzhenitsyn, Первый Kruг. You know, when I was, I don't know, I'd only done a year or something at Russian, but there we are. And read that, and although I mean we saw the bad, whatever you might call it, you know, the police presence around. We were very obviously, this is 1967, I think, very obviously, you know, from the West, and you didn't have that many people from the West then. You were chatting to girls, you know, the police would come over and the girls would look frightened and say, "Oh, we've got to go, otherwise we'll be in trouble." And so, but you know, I bought wonderful classical records for the equivalent of tuppence or something, and Pushkin poems for nothing. You know, it was, and the fact that, well, even though it was not brilliant, but people had housing and they had childcare, they had jobs. And I'm not, you know, it wasn't great, but it was. There was a sense in which those basic things were being looked after. They could have been done better, I'm sure, but that. So I was interested in what was happening. So that led me to. Well, I've got a feeling I probably hadn't read the Bukharin at that point, but read the Bukharin when I came back. And I remember giving a talk to my mum. Was in this local conservative group. It was called the Tuesday Club because they met on a Tuesday. But it was a nice ladies in Streatham. Yeah. And I gave a talk with. I'd taken slides and stuff of the trip to the Soviet Union, which actually for them was pretty heavy duty stuff. Yeah. I mean, even the mention of going. and I remember the reaction. They were all actually quite sort of dumbstruck that I was saying positive things about it. Okay, it was a pretty limited experience, but no, certainly I was very interested just in Russian culture. Yeah. That made me think I'd been more interested in finding out. Yeah. They called what I'd called the Second World War, they called the Great Patriotic War. So I went, why? I didn't know until I'd been there how many millions of Russians had died. And I thought, well, actually, that's sort of probably in sort of statistical terms, a bigger sacrifice than ours. I didn't know about the whole. I hadn't been taught anything at school of their role in the Second World War. I didn't know any of that. And my school, which is supposed to be a quote good school, taught a completely crap history. You didn't join any bits of history up, you did chunks of it. Henry VIII created the British Navy sort of thing, then you leap up to the Corn Laws or something. And it was, so I was in a sense primed for reading Marx and Engels by the poor education I had. Because suddenly I read this stuff that started to make sense. And you saw things being linked. And so that comes from, right, that's interesting, I didn't know that. And my God, did they really do that? And it's just, and I had what would have been considered, okay, it wasn't a public school, but, a good grammar school education. And it was, in many respects, rubbish. Certainly in geography and history. I didn't do any politics. So going to the Soviet Union was fantastic. Yeah. So we went by train. First we went through Berlin, did Checkpoint Charlie and all that, into East Berlin, into Warsaw, stayed in Warsaw, then to Moscow, Leningrad, went to Kiev, then got the boat back around the Baltic.
Did you?
Brilliant.
Wow. So did you took the train?
Yeah.
In a group of how many?
I don't know, 12 maybe? Not bigger than that.
Okay, wow.
With a teacher who spoke changed his language as he went through the borders. He was teaching himself Chinese from Russian.
Okay, wow.
And he was slightly bonkers, but when we had these school elections, to get you used to citizenship, he stood as a Maoist. And got 2 votes or something.
We should have his name on record, shouldn't we?
Oh, his name was Craddock. We called him Joe, but Joe is because of Stalin. His actual name was Paul Craddock, that's what he would say. And it was all right. It's an odd thing because his lessons were both extraordinary for me because I became, as did some of my friends, very good at Russian, but he was no good at teaching people that couldn't keep up.
Yeah.
So I was saying, I don't know if we'd had an immersive system, which in the 60s was quite progressive. So everything was in Russian, and it had a tape with little slides, and so I don't know, a hedgehog or someone would say good morning in Russian, whatever it was. And then he stepped the pace up, and my friends he got A's at O level, then A's at A level. But en route, a load of people dropped out because they couldn't keep up, and they got nothing. And that was the first time I'd sort of become aware that this system actually wasn't all that good. Because, I might have come out of it, although I was probably an emotional wreck, because it's not, you're not a balanced human being. In fact, they were all fucked up. It was an all-boys school, of course.
Okay.
It wanted to be a public school, but it wasn't because it was. But it had houses and it rode and it did all that stuff, But I came out of it great love of Russian. But a load of people got nothing. I don't know if they got nothing, but I didn't talk to them about it. But they didn't get their O levels and didn't get their A levels. So it's a destructive system.
Do you think that theatre has any place in contemporary cultural politics, given the sort of horrible situation we're in globally following Brexit and the Trump victory?
It's pretty hard now because it's odd because it's the general level of the sort of quality of production has gone up.
Right.
You find now a much broader spectrum of stuff that is, in quotes, well done.
Yeah.
But an awful lot of it, or most of it, is fairly meaningless in any sort of political sense.
Yeah.
Because it's part of the entertainment industry.
Yeah. So you think it's a kind of shift in institutions or kind of...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You've got, the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company do basically a package decent, if you're going to pay, it's a bloody lot of money to go to the theatre. And so you don't necessarily want to have how awful the world is poked up your nose, but I'm not saying that's the only thing political theatre does, but I find most of it pretty bland, really, and I don't know, that's, but, theatre goes up in like all art forms.
Yeah.
What happened in the late 60s, early 70s, when I happened to just come into it, when it was very political, may happen again. And you've got also theatre, politics has become more theatrical, in a sense. Trump's whole shtick is theatrical in a way.
Yeah.
And you've got the Occupy and all of that using what would have been street theatre tactics in a way which is now pretty commonplace.
Yeah.
And also you've got the non-polygon, but you look at a marathon, everybody's dressed up.
Yeah. And do you feel like that
could be something else?
That restricts the possibility of theatre being political because its techniques have been taken over by other kinds of
I just think about what you want to do.
Yeah.
And I think and find out what you think theatre can do.
Yeah.
And if it's I suspect in the age we're living in of new technologies and all that, probably what it's going to be best at is just exploring what it is to be human and the morality of choices.
Yeah.
Because it's the only art, well, not the only art, but it's an art form where the person presenting something and the person watching it, they're in the same room together in real time, and they're talking. Dance does it, but you don't talk in it.
Which is an increasingly rare experience, I guess.
Yeah, cinema obviously doesn't do it. You watch things on streaming or whatever. You can be with an orchestra. I love live music, but it's doing something different.
Sure.
And I think that may be where it's got to look at. And because the stuff we were doing when street theatre is slightly different, because that was about making a political point, and maybe that will happen as well. Or people like it happen. It is being done, but it's slightly different now. I don't know whether people would sort of sit down and write plays. You get things like verbatim theatre, which is bringing subjective experience, and that can be political, and often people do come out of that saying, oh my God, is that really what people are going through? The tricky bit there is it can leave you there, but I'm not saying it should be doing, I'm not saying you should have answers everything, but you take, I don't know if you saw Ken Loach's film, I, Daniel Blake, but a lot of, when I saw it, you could hear people in the audience sort of saying, they didn't know the system was like that. Which, okay, so that's doing something, but if you did know it was like that, and I think it's actually worse, it's a slightly, in some ways, a romanticised version of the working class within that, because he shows lots of people, I don't attack Ken Loach, but, but that's got to be part of something else, which I suppose it always has got to be. You can never do it on its own. No, I think it's still, I think what you think of as political has changed. Because it used to be much more, we know what politics are now. That then went in this actually through all the stuff I was talking about. Being a woman was political, being that was political. So we've redefined politics, and so we've redefined what cultural intervention